The cardiac cycle is essentially all of the events that take place during one heartbeat, okay, during one contraction relaxation cycle of the heart. Now, when we talk about this, we use specialized terms for contraction and relaxation, and those terms are systole, or some people will say it's systole, and diastole, or some people will say diastole. So systole is contraction, whereas diastole is relaxation. Now, some people will say things like atrial systole, atrial diastole, ventricular systole, ventricular diastole. Some people will say the heart is in systole. So if there's no sort of like precursor to that to tell you whether they're talking about the atria or the ventricles, assume that they are talking about the ventricles. So if they say the heart is in systole, they're talking about ventricular systole, and that means ventricular contraction. So that's sort of something to just sort of keep in mind. All right, so we're going to do this, and I am just going to draw atria, ventricles, and the valves, okay? Because the SL valves are going to do the same thing. Both of them, both the aortic, the pulmonary valve will do the same thing, and the atrioventricular valves will do the same thing. Both the right and the left atrioventricular valves will do the same thing. Okay, and then your left and right atria do the same thing at the same time, and then the left and right ventricles do the same thing at the same time. So when we look at this, the first thing that we're going to start off with is we're going to start with the atrium and the ventricle, okay, and then the ventricle and the major vessel, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to draw our valves in here like this. Remember, these valves are shaped like this. These valves are shaped like this. So we'll put atria here, ventricle down here. We're going to draw this a couple times. So we're going to put vessel up here, and we'll put ventricle down here. Okay. Now, when we start, right, we will start with the heart in a relaxed state. When the heart is in a relaxed state, this valve is open. The AV valves are open, and the blood will flow from the atria to the ventricles following gravity. When the heart is in a relaxed state, these valves here, the SL valves, are closed because blood is sort of being pulled in that vessel by gravity downwards that way. So we have a force pushing down on those vessels to close, or the valves to close them. Okay, so the first thing that's going to happen is that the AV or the SA node is going to fire, right? So if your SA node fires, okay, and that's going to create atrial depolarization and atrial systole. Okay, so what's happening in atrial systole? So let's say in atrial systole, right, we'll put a box around it in blue so that we can follow it over here. The atria are going to contract. So the atrium's going to contract. Okay, so this is going to increase the force here, right? Because we are going to decrease the volume of the chamber, which is going to increase the pressure inside of the chamber. Okay, so that's going to increase the force down. So when we enter atrial systole, we're going to enter a phase known as active filling. Okay, now notice prior to that, we had what we known as passive filling. Okay, because we weren't actually contracting the atria, but blood was flowing from the atria down into the ventricles. Okay, so when that SA node fires, the atria contract and it forces blood down into the ventricles. Okay, so we're filling up the ventricles. All right, now that signal is going to move from the SA node, right? Where's it going to move? It's going to move into the AV node. Okay, and when it moves into the AV node, what's going to happen as these ventricles are going to start to contract a little bit. Okay, not a whole lot, but a little bit, sort of just passing the signal from one place to the next, okay? And then it's going to move into the bundle of His, and that's where we're going to start to see some real ventricular systole, okay? So we're going to say ventricular systole, okay? So we get that ventricular systole. So what's going to happen during ventricular systole, okay, sort of move this up a little bit, is that this ventricle here, let's do this in purple, right? This ventricle is going to start to contract. Okay, the ventricle is going to start to contract. This one too, right? It's really the same thing. That ventricle contracts. So when that ventricle starts to contract and we enter that ventricular systole, right, what's going to happen is that our AV valves are going to close. Okay, the AV valves are going to close because we're going to put pressure on them like so. Okay, now where do they close at the bundle of His? Do they close at the AV node? It's sort of like in the middle, right? But they do close. Okay, and so notice that when they close, right, we still have over here, we have a force pushing here, right? But now we have a force sort of pushing in this direction. So we have two forces pushing. But this force here is not enough to actually exceed this force pushing down. So what's going to happen is the ventricles are going to contract, but blood is not going to move anywhere. This is what we refer to as isovolumetric contraction. This is isovolumetric contraction. Okay? Now, as the signal continues to move through the bundle of His and into the Purkinje fibers, at a certain point, what's going to happen is that this force here is going to get really high. This force inside of here is going to get really high, and it's going to push those valves sort of open. So let's go ahead and redraw what happens at the state of ventricular systole. Okay, so what we have happening here is that we're going to have those AV valves are going to be closed. Okay, and then let's sort of draw this one over here. Now we have these valves opened up, like so. So because of that, now blood will flow from the ventricles out into the vessels. So this is going to lead to what we refer to as ventricular ejection. Okay, so blood is going to actually be ejected from the ventricles into the vessels. Okay, so then, right, what's going to happen is that signal is going to be lost, and we're going to enter what we call ventricular diastole. So we'll enter ventricular diastole. Ventricular diastole. So what's going to happen now, right, is that these ventricles are eventually going to start to relax. Okay, they start to relax. Now, when they start to relax, what's going to happen? Right, when we enter this ventricular diastole, this force that is being pushed up in this direction is going to be lost. So what's going to happen is that those SL valves are going to close. But what's going to happen is that our AV valves are going to stay closed for a second. Not really a second, for like a half a millisecond, right? We're going to enter something known as isovolumetric relaxation. And what's happening during isovolumetric relaxation is that all the valves are going to be closed. This ventricle is going to be relaxing. But remember that this valve here, that AV valve, it's kind of stuck together. So you need to decrease the pressure to almost like pop that valve sort of open. And that's what's going to happen during that isovolumetric relaxation stage. Now, eventually, what's going to happen is that the pressure will create a vacuum inside of that ventricle and pull that AV valve open, right? And when that AV valve opens, we have blood inside of here. So the blood will then flow through that valve. So that will lead to, can you guess? We're back to passive filling. Okay, so we're back to passive filling. So if we sort of look at all of our steps, sort of just zoom out a little bit, right? Notice that we're back at passive filling and we can start this all over again, right? Because it's a cycle, right? So we can start it over again and we can go through this cardiac cycle, right? Now, what you should try to do is that you should try to write out all of the steps that happen during the cardiac cycle and see if you can get them down before you watch the next video where I will write down all the steps of the cardiac cycle with you.